A CBS News YouGov poll for CBS DFW found that Texans feel differently about abortion than the rest of the country, and there are also key differences depending on gender and age. Anthony Salvanto, CBS News Director of Election Surveys, joins us now. Welcome, Anthony. And so talk to us a little bit about these results.
Hey, Jack, great to talk to you. I want to show you the gender breakdown that you mentioned right there at the outset, because it's really important. In the state of Texas, what do you want abortion to be, legal or illegal? You see a slight majority of men saying legal, but look at the difference with women. It is much higher at 62%. That is somewhat like what we see nationally in 67% of women having disapproved of the overturn of Roe v. Wade. But these gender breaks are important, and I would add this, Jack. You're going to see a lot of partisan talk around what should happen with abortion in Texas as well as in the nation. And I would point out, you've got the party splits, maybe not unexpected here. Democrats saying it ought to be on balance legal, Republicans, majority, saying illegal in at least most, in some cases. But it's not universal. And when you look at Texas, you see that you've got 1 out of 5 Democrats who says it should be illegal, and you've got a third of Republicans who fall into the mostly legal camp. And so that is a point I point out, not just in Texas, but in the nation. You don't have uniformity on this across partisanship. It's often about gender. It's often about church attendance. It's often about age. So there are breaks on all of those. It cuts across, Jack.
You know, I'm looking at that graphic right behind you, and when it mentions independence, and because more and more Texans are independents, and that's really going to be, I mean, that's fascinating to me. What do you make of that? Is it like, what, a 10-point spread there, 55 to 45%?
Yeah. This is described in part, when you talk about Texans becoming more and more independent, it's often the case that younger people are registering as independents or considering themselves independents, and that then dovetails with some of the age breaks that you see in Texas and also nationally. You've got younger people who are more likely to say abortion ought to be legal, and so you may have that, you do have that connected to the independence answer as well, Jack.
And the differences between Texans and people across the country, that was pretty dramatic as well. And I guess maybe you can understand that, right? Because there are a lot of Republicans here in Texas. It's still a red state.
Yeah. That's really sort of sometimes the simplest answer is the first one you go to, and that's right. There are more Republicans, and Republicans are more likely to say that it ought to be illegal. But, you know, having said that, we want to add this. When you ask the question, as we break it down, how it should be legal in all cases, most cases, or illegal in most cases, you want to look at this distribution because there's a quarter who say legal in all cases. There's relatively very few, I want to point out, this is the case in Texas, also the case nationally, who say it should be illegal in all cases. And so many people fall into these middle categories here. Legal in most cases, but not all. Illegal in most cases, but not all. And this is where you get into policy differences and preferences, but also important to see that people sort of distinguish or gradiate on this as well, Jack.
The people in the middle, I mean, it's you know, not the extremes, I guess, is what you're talking about. And one of the interesting things to me was, you know, over the, I guess, late last year, there was a lot of controversy over the Texas Heartbeat Act, which is the current law before the new law goes into effect. And that is, you know, once a cardiac activity is detected, no more abortions are allowed, and that basically you couldn't enforce it through the normal channels. It had to be enforced through civil lawsuits. Now there's this trigger law that was also passed in the last year in the legislative session that a lot of people didn't even know about, and you asked people about that.
Yeah, we did. Let me pull up that graphic for you in a second. One of the things that we wanted to know was, what do people think is going to happen going forward from this? And the polling was conducted largely prior to the announcement of the decision overturning Roe v. Wade, but that decision was widely anticipated. So you can talk to people about what they've heard in Texas. There aren't a lot of people who reported that they knew a lot about what you described there as the trigger law. Okay, so that's something that I want to watch going forward. Are more people going to get attuned to that, pay attention to that now that Roe v. Wade has in fact been overturned, and now it goes back to the states, where in Texas and in other places you're seeing these laws come into effect? Okay, so that's number one. But also, you want to say, what do you think is going to happen now, especially with women? And one of the things we asked and looked at that I want to bring up is, do people think there's going to be more services now for pregnant women? And you look at the folks among all Texans, it's split whether they think this is going to be happening. But those who say abortion ought to be illegal are more likely to think that there will in fact be more services. Those who feel it should be legal are more pessimistic from their point of view about things. There's 2/3 who think that there won't be those services. So it's not just the new laws going into effect, it's what do people think are the implications now? And you see those breaks and those splits partly depending on what you think about the legality or illegality of abortion in the first place, Jack.
Well, that's interesting, because when I was speaking with a Republican lawmaker who authored the trigger law, he said that he favors adding services for prenatal and postnatal care for women and their newborns. And when I spoke with a Democratic lawmaker, she wasn't that optimistic that the Republican-dominated legislature would do that. So that is going to be very interesting to see how that pans out when the next legislative session starts in January. But I just wanted to ask you about the trigger law, because, and that other graphic that you had that showed nearly half of the people didn't know about this. And this, for people who don't know about the trigger law, which is going to take effect in mid-August unless that's successfully challenged, that's going to ban most abortions for the exception of life, to save the life of the mother. And it requires, if doctors are convicted of performing abortions, they could be facing life in prison and at least $100,000 in fines. So that's out there. But I just was curious what you made of that number, and people not necessarily realizing almost half.
I think anytime you have major news on something, especially like this, it's going to become more salient for people. That, you know, some, and certainly there's going to be people who have been activists on either side of this who've been paying a lot of attention. Certainly there are highly politically engaged people who are paying attention to this and have been all along. They're going to be the ones who are going to be falling into that a lot, even some camps. But now that this is on the news, now that it's being discussed, we're talking about it, everybody's talking about it, does that then raise the awareness of this? When we talk about the implications going forward, when we talk about those laws, these are important numbers, because as we go forward, then if people learn about it, then we're going to have to measure what they think about it. And we're going to see it play out in terms of policy and impact, and they're going to evaluate it. So I agree with you. These are really, really critical questions to ask and things to watch going forward. This could be really one of the core things to watch, Jack.
And what did people think when you asked them, you know, if it is going to be illegal, which it is in Texas, what did people think was going to happen?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that they say is 77% said they think women will still seek abortions even if it's unsafe. And we're talking about, again, people's perception of the implications here going forward. Some of this, a lot of this is being driven by the people who feel that it ought to be legal. And that's one thing to look at. Look at this, though, 67% feeling like there'd be more neglected children. So that's another negative implication that's seen by the public. And there's comparably fewer, still a slight majority, but comparably fewer who feel that more children will be adopted. And that's part of the discussion that you often hear, especially on those who are in favor of abortion bans or abortion limits. So you've got this difference here, but this big number who feel that women will still seek abortions, even if unsafe, at 77%, is another thing to watch. Again, as this plays out, how does the public react, and what do they think is actually happening now that these new laws are in effect?
And you know, the thing that I think is going to be so fascinating to watch over the next several months as we get closer to the November elections is what impact this issue will have, because historically it may not have led people to the polls, but that was under Roe v. Wade, the fact that it was part of the landscape. Now that it is no longer the landscape, you know, how is this going to impact the elections, and will this galvanize Democrats enough to make up for the perceived disadvantages they have going into November?
Yeah, in Texas in particular, but nationwide, I want to go back to this chart because the difference between men and women here becomes important politically too, to a sense. And that is the Democrats, which you mentioned, rely on women voters. Joe Biden won women voters, Democrats, and when they did well in the midterms in 2018, won women voters, suburban women, handily. This is a key part of the Democratic constituency. So if they are in fact energized, if it does become a very salient and motivating issue for women, then we get a slightly different direction to the way the midterms are going. Maybe it mitigates some of what we expect are going to be a lot of Republican gains. Certainly the Democrats will hope so. And the other thing is, and then I'll want to compare a little bit Texas to the nation here. Let me see if I have this slide on the nation, because after Roe v. Wade was overturned, we asked whether or not it would make you, and this again nationally, more likely or less likely to vote. And you saw Democrats say that they'd be more likely to vote based on what had just happened, more so than Republicans. Now, part of this could be anytime people have something in the perception of Democrats taken away as opposed to rewarding voters, rewarding the process, you might get this kind of discrepancy. But Democrats are certainly hoping that this is something to watch going forward, that this sustains itself going forward, and they can get more lower propensity voters, at least on a midterm, to turn out. So again, as you and I talk and prepare to talk as we go through the fall, this is one of those things to watch. This is one of those political implications, and this is the benchmark to sort of gauge it against as we head into the fall, Jack.
And looking at that graphic there, the fact that independents, 61% it would have no effect on, 77% of Republicans it wouldn't have any effect on, that could very well be because they were already motivated to go to the polls.
A lot of that is baked in here, right? A lot of that is. I think the way to watch this going forward is you and I will look at the lower propensity to sort of middle propensity voters, which is to say people who vote but don't necessarily turn out in midterms. And there's a lot of those voters because midterms always have relatively lower turnout than a national. You might see about 50%, about half turnout in a conventional midterm. Well, as we look at voters who might be on the fence about turning out, if they, A, decide to say they're going to vote or do early, and then B, say that they're motivated by the Roe v. Wade decision, for or against, now we have an effect to measure. And that's something that then we can actually say, yes, this is having an impact and it's favoring one part or the other, or no, this is not having an impact. And that's part of how we watch this going forward, Jack.
Well, Anthony, I really appreciate all of your insight. Thank you so much for joining us today. Anthony Savanto, CBS News. Thank you so much.